preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 92nd Street Y. I am Rabbi David Woznicka, Director of the Wise Bronfman Center for Jewish Life. It's always my privilege to introduce the speakers for the Bronfman Center, but as many of you know, it's always my desire to tell you about some programs that are coming up here at the Y, which I think will be of some interest to you. All of this information is in your handy-dandy 92nd Street Y Bronfman Center for Jewish Life booklet with a little insert. But I just want to point out a couple things which I think are of particular note. Galia Golan, who is the head of the Lay for Women Studies at Hebrew University, will be here next week to talk about the status of women in Israel. Leon Wieseltier and Cynthia Ozick, we have just arranged, who will be here to talk about Wieseltier's new book called Kaddish, which has received critical acclaim. They'll be talking about issues of death and dying and mourning. That's in January. I think that will be particularly interesting. Our forum on contemporary values includes myself along with Rabbi Joseph Telushkin in dialogues with men and women who have had influence on world events. Upcoming ones include a dialogue with Ambassador Dori Gold, who's the United Nations Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Rabbi Abraham Twersky, who by profession is a psychiatrist, who created Gateway, a clinic for clinically dependent people in Pittsburgh, and has written some 25 or 30 books on basically how to be decent, and Rabbi Harold Kushner, who many of you know, will be here in May for a dialogue. On Sunday, Rabbi Daniel Hartman will be here to talk about Jewish identity. Dr. Alice Shalvey will be here in a few months. The best way I describe her, and I've done this in front of her, and I think she likes it, is she is indeed perhaps the grandmother of the feminist movement in Israel. Fantastic teacher, and I hope you'll have take an opportunity to study with her. And finally, not finally, two other things. One is that we have a Hanukkah program this Sunday. It's one of the great programs for kids. They can sing and dance and scream and have a grand old time. And then finally, on this issue, classes. All of that's in here. But I always tell people, if you want to have an impact on your life as Jews, don't just come to a lecture. A lecture's nice, may leave you with some thoughts. But if you want your life to be enriched in a more profound way, enroll in classes. Take courses in Jewish law, take courses in Kabbalah, take courses in Zionism, take courses in Torah study, take courses in what does it mean to be a Jew. And your life can be impacted. By the way, I am very proud to tell you that nearly 1,000 students now take courses in Jewish education over the course of the year here at the Y. Join them, but sign up early because a lot of the classes sell out, and we have 50 or 60 people in many of them, in several of them. Okay, the appetite is whet. Let me tell you a little bit about our speaker tonight. J.J. Goldberg is a native New Yorker. He studied Hebrew literature at McGill University and received a master's in journalism from Columbia University. He lived and worked in Israel in the 1970s, serving as an educator at the World Zionist Organization and as an official of the kibbutz movement. He now writes and lectures on the politics of the Middle East and the Jewish world. He is a syndicated columnist, featured weekly in New York's Jewish Week, as well as other journals around the country. He is also a contributing editor of the Jerusalem Report and New York correspondent for the London Jewish Chronicle. His essays on Israeli and American politics have appeared frequently in the New York Times, Newsday, and other journals. Mr. Goldberg has won numerous journalism awards on a wide range of topics. In 1987, he received the prestigious Corporation for Public Broadcasting Award for his radio documentary on Jewish popular music in America, which was broadcast on National Public Radio, NPR. He is the author of 3 books, most recently, Jewish Power, Inside the American Jewish Establishment, which, by the way, is available for your purchase after the lecture, and JJ will happily personalize them to you. I just want to add a personal note. As many of you know, I have introduced an awful lot of speakers here at the Y. I have sat on this stage with an awful lot of men and women having discussions and dialogues and lecturing myself. Sometimes I know speakers by reputation, and sometimes I know them a little more personally. I have come to know JJ in the last few years. We live in the same building. He and Shifra and their children play with my children and my wife and I. And in between, we try to slip away for moments of conversations. And I can tell you quite frankly, and in all candor, and you know I am not one to use hyperbole, and I know this not only from reading his column regularly in the Jewish Week, but even more from private conversations, that on issues related to Jews and Judaism or Israeli politics, JJ is quite simply one of the most thoughtful and well-informed journalists in the United States. He is a genuine treasure, and that is why I am particularly proud to introduce him to you tonight to talk about Jewish power, the myths and realities of American Jewish political influence. Ladies and gentlemen, J.J. Goldberg.
You know, there's a story about a guy who's at St. Vincent's Hospital, and he insists on being transferred to Beth Israel. Can we get the house lights up a little bit? There you are. Guy insists on being transferred to Beth Israel, and he finally gets there. Social worker comes by with a clipboard for the intake interview. She says, "Why did you have to be transferred from St. Vincent's to Beth Israel? Was it the medical care? Was there something wrong with the doctors?" He says, "I couldn't complain." She says, "Well, was it the nursing care? Was it the way the hospital treated you?" He says, "I couldn't complain." She says, "Well, was it the way the place looked? Was it the feel? Was it the food?" He says, "I couldn't complain." She says, "Then why did you need to be transferred to Beth Israel?" He says, "Because here I can complain." I thought of this joke today because, well, it's the 57th anniversary this week of Pearl Harbor. It was 57 years ago, I guess, on Sunday or yesterday, that the Japanese government did us the rather gruesome favor of getting us into World War II. If it hadn't been for that, America might not have entered World War II, and Hitler might have been in a position to kill every Jew in the world, which was exactly what he had in mind. Certainly, if it were for our sakes, America was not interested in going into World War II. Franklin Roosevelt, as the public called him, could have stood on his head if he was capable. He couldn't have gotten America into World War II. Nobody wanted to listen. It's ironic because over the last few days we've seen international conferences convening in Washington, one, to find ways of finalizing World War II by restoring the property of the Jews who suffered in World War II. Rather extraordinary thing. It's kind of hard to imagine, for example, an international conference to restore the property of the people massacred in Rwanda. And there was another international conference running at the same time to consider how to fund the Palestinian Authority, which is part of the process of accepting the Palestinian acceptance, 51 years late, of the UN partition plan creating the State of Israel. It took them decades to accept that Palestine, the land of Israel, was now divided and they were only going to get part of it. A smaller part as each year goes by. But they finally bought in, and now the question is how to get them stabilized. And so there are these two international conferences meeting in Washington, one convened by the Undersecretary of State Stuart Eisenstadt, one essentially organized by the Assistant Secretary of State Dennis Ross with his assistant Aaron Miller. And if you read the Jewish weeklies around the country over the last few days, what's interesting is the drumbeat of the twilight of Jewish power. Jews no longer have any influence in this country. D'Amato didn't get reelected, for example. Jonathan Pollard is still in jail. The Jews can't get anything done in this country. We have reached the end of our run. Jews are not comfortable with the idea of looking at our situation realistically. We don't know how to look at where we are in the world, see ourselves through others' eyes, accept our limitations, and be happy with what we've got. As the joke goes, we like to complain. Let me tell you a story. I wrote about this last fall, but I didn't tell you the whole story when I wrote my column. It was a little over a year ago, October 6, 1997. There was a dinner at the White House for the Israeli president, Ezer Weitzman. Now, there's a story behind why Weitzman was visiting Washington and how he ended up having a dinner at the White House. At the time, the U.S. government and the Israeli government were in conflict. They frequently have been over the last few years. The peace process was frozen. The Israelis and the Palestinians weren't talking. The White House was trying to find a formula that would get the talks between the Israelis and Palestinians moving again. Netanyahu was saying no to every proposal that the Americans offered. Tensions were reaching the point in Israel, that is between Israel and America, that Netanyahu was feeling political heat, because the one thing you can't do as an Israeli prime minister is ruin the relationship with America. Nothing is more important to the Israeli voter than knowing that U.S.-Israeli relations are in good hands. And so Netanyahu asked for an invitation to the White House because he wanted to show the Israeli voter that he could stand up and say no to everything that the White House asked and still get invited to the Oval Office. And for the very same reason, the White House didn't want to invite him that month. Netanyahu made such a big issue of it and attempted to portray it as America's turning anti-Israel. That's why the Prime Minister wasn't getting invited to the White House, that they went ahead and decided to show him who was boss by inviting the President of Israel. Weitzman was invited to Washington to insult Bibi Netanyahu and put an end run around him to the Israeli voter to show that it wasn't about Israel, it was about Netanyahu. Having invited Weitzman to Washington on an official state visit, one of the things you have to do when a foreign head of state visits Washington is throw a fancy state dinner. You know, the black tie, Barbara Streisand visits, Yo-Yo Ma plays the cello. It gets written up on the front page of the Washington Post style section, and everybody talks about how great relations are, and that's exactly what they didn't want to do. So what can you do? They didn't want to send that message. The alternative to a state dinner is what's called a working dinner. The White House and its staff get together with the visiting dignitary and his or her staff, and they spend 3 hours doing work together. Well, here's the problem. What kind of work can you do with the President of Israel? He doesn't do anything. Spend 3 hours discussing how to cut a ribbon. So what they did, they actually came up with a solution that turned out to be quite interesting. They put together a working dinner at which they brainstormed for 3 hours on what the next stage of U.S.-Israeli relations should be. What can America do now to get what had been the Israeli-Palestinian impasse and was now becoming the Israeli-American impasse out of the mud and moving forward again? Should America pressure Israel? Should America pressure the Israelis and the Palestinians? Should America just walk away and let the Israelis and Palestinians stew? What should America do? The President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and the Chief Middle East Advisor to each of the above, 4 more people and another 2 or 3 others involved in the issue, together with the President of Israel, his Chief Military Aide, the Israeli Ambassador, his number 2, 2 or 3 other Israeli officials that are closely involved in the issue and were part of the President's party, plus the leadership of the American Jewish community, by which I mean 10 representatives of the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, and as is customary, 2 major donors from the ruling party. In Reagan's day, every time there was a meeting between Jewish leaders and the White House, they'd invite Max Fisher and George Klein from the Republican Party. Now they invited Danny Abraham and Jack Bentheim from the Democratic Party, the point being the president gets to have 2 friends in the visiting group. But essentially the delegation is chosen by the Conference of Presidents of Jewish organizations. That's how these things work. And the 3 sides sat down to discuss what to do next. And everybody had input, there was some arguing, there was some controversy. What they decided is not as interesting as the fact that when the president decides he needs to figure out what to do in the Middle East, he brings in the 3 parties to the discussion. The three groups that need to be in a discussion of U.S. policy in the Middle East: the American government, the Israeli government, and the Jewish community. That should tell you something about the influence and the role of the American Jewish community in American life today. We think if we're lucky, somebody will listen to us. If we're unlucky, nobody will. And look at all the things that are going wrong. Jonathan Pollard's still in jail. We didn't bomb Iraq. Obviously, the Jewish community has no influence, and here's the proof. Looking at it from their eyes, if they want to get something done, they need to touch base with three groups: the American government, which will formulate and carry out the policy; the Israeli government, which has to receive it somehow; and the Jewish community, without which the American government can't do much in the Middle East. The other interesting fact is that Clinton and Gore were probably the only non-Jews in the room, depending on how Madeleine Albright was thinking of herself that week. The Jewish community is a player in the American political system. There is no getting around the fact. The only question that you can ask is, what do you mean by the Jewish community? Who is speaking in its name this week? And what are its policies? How do they get formulated? And what do you do to contribute or not contribute to the formulation of those policies? There is an elected leadership that plays a role. Most of us don't vote. In fact, most of us don't even know that this is going on. Everybody knows about it, basically, but us. There are 11 Jews in the U.S. Senate, 11%. There's a minyan. It's a minyan they can't meet. 2 are women and 1's Orthodox. But there are 11 Jews in the U.S. Senate. This is a phenomenal statement. There are factions within the Jewish membership of the U.S. Senate. There's the hardliners on Israel. Arlen Specter, Joe Lieberman, now it looks like Chuck Schumer is going to be part of that group. There are the Doves, Frank Lautenberg, Carl Levin, and they interact and they work out their issues before they go to the floor. I had a very strange conversation once with an assistant to Russell Feingold from Wisconsin. He's one of the 2 Jewish senators from Wisconsin. And this assistant was explaining to me there was a vote coming up about Jerusalem. It was a question of moving the U.S. Embassy. It was very subtle because the Israeli lobby wanted the U.S. Embassy moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, but the Israeli government didn't, because there's supposed to be negotiations at some point, and they didn't want to close too many doors to negotiations because then the Arabs respond with their unilateral moves. Anyway, it was very confusing. It wasn't clear. There was crazy signals going on. Feingold's office got a call from some non-Jewish senator from the Midwest saying, how are we supposed to vote? Feingold's with Paul Wellstone from Minnesota, a left-wing, intermarried Jewish socialist. Got to Washington, started getting calls like this. And his initial reaction was, why are you asking me? What does this have to do with me? And the senators would give him this look like, are you from Mars? Of course it has to do with you. You tell me how I'm supposed to vote. It's your issue. And then he would run off to Lautenberg or Lieberman and say, fill me in. What's our position on this? We play a role. Now, how do they know? They work it out together with the Conference of Presidents, the Anti-Defamation League, the Council of Jewish Federations. There is a Jewish political system that makes these decisions, and everybody knows it but us. There are probably 36, by my last count, foreign embassies in Washington that have attachés whose assignment, or part of whose assignment, is relations with the Jewish community, an attaché for Jewish affairs. You have one for military affairs, relation with the Pentagon; labor affairs, relation with the AFL-CIO; for cultural affairs; for business affairs; for Jewish affairs. It's one of the power centers in America that foreign embassies want to be in touch with. You could talk to for example, the attaché at the Japanese embassy, and he could give you a list of the 10 most influential Jewish organizations and what you talk to each one about. The Jewish Council for Public Affairs, used to be known as NACRAC. You talk to them about general domestic policy. Hadassah and the National Council of Jewish Women about abortion rights, women's health, children's issues. The Conference of Presidents and the Anti-Defamation League about foreign policy. They know this stuff. They don't have a problem with it. Nobody has a problem with it but us and the Arabs. There's a funny story. Last March, you may remember this. There was a town meeting at Ohio State University. Remember this? We were on the verge, as usual, of going to war with Iraq. the president needed to go to the public and explain why we might be about to be at war. It was several weeks after Monica Lewinsky became public knowledge, and he didn't feel like facing a crowd of citizens. So he sent the B team, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Advisor. And they sat there in this auditorium in Columbus, Ohio for an hour or whatever, getting heckled by a crowd of yo-yos from the upper bleachers and not knowing how to handle it. And the public was watching all over America, all over the world. And for days, if you read the op-ed pages or just talked to anybody on the street, people are wondering, should he have gone himself? Was it a bad risk sending the B team? Is this how they run their government? If they can't explain why we're going to war, why are we going to war? If they can't handle a town meeting, how are they going to run a war? If you go around the world and look at the reaction, it was a little bit different. The Arab press over the next few days was full of comments like, well, now they've finally made it public. Madeleine Albright, William Cohen, and Samuel Berger, the three Jews who run American foreign policy. In Israel, the reaction was a little different still. I mean, I was in Israel a few weeks before that, and I heard this sort of talk. I was driving from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv one evening listening to talk radio. Somebody's calling and complaining about American policies. Look who runs it. It's a converted Jew, a half Jew, and a reformed Jew. No wonder we're in dread. It is not only where we are, but what kind of Jews we are that makes a difference. There are factions within the Jewish community. The world knows this. It's no secret. We are a power to be reckoned with. Now, how do we deal with this? I'll tell you, my book came out about 2 years ago, Jewish Power. If you've seen it, it's got a big red, white cover in big red letters. It says Jewish Power, and an American flag with a big Jewish star in the middle of it. I didn't pick this. I was a little uncomfortable with it. It's a tad inflammatory. It was interesting going on a book tour. You go around, November's Jewish Book Month, and every JCC in the country has a Jewish book fair. What happens is you fly into a city, somebody comes and picks you up at the airport, a volunteer from the JCC, and they hold up a copy of your book so you can find them. City after city, I found people who had managed to take a look at my book, run home, find some shirt cardboard and a magic marker, and write my name. Nobody was holding up my book because people were uncomfortable. Jews are not comfortable with the idea of Jewish power. Well, now there's some justice to this. There is a long, long history of Jewish power being a fictional excuse for non-Jews to hate us, to demonize us, to attack us. And the irony is, we never had the power to defend ourselves. It was a fantasy. Jews poison the wells. Jews run the banks. Jews run Congress. Jews kill God. How powerful do you have to be to kill God? And we couldn't do a thing about it. Today, we can. Everything is different today. Well, not everything, but much is different today. Go back 60 years. 1938. Living memory of probably quite a few people in this room. Just before I was born. In the spring of that, I guess it was the winter of 39 actually, a little less than 60 years ago, Senator Wagner of New York brought a bill before Congress, before the Senate, proposing 20,000 visas for Jewish youngsters from Germany and Austria to be brought here temporarily and put in foster homes organized by the Quakers to get them out of the way of the Nazis. Congress said flat no, in horror. There were at the time about 60 other bills before Congress to restrict immigration even further because too many Jews were coming in. Nobody could do anything about it. There was testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the head of the Allied Patriotic Societies, Francis Kinnicott, testified. It was an interesting, fascinating testimony. The Allied Patriotic Societies was a sort of a conference. It included the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of Liberty, the American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign Wars. In the context of the times, you could have called it a conference of presidents of major anti-Semitic organizations. And Francis Kinnicott sat there and he said, and I quote, "In fact, gentlemen," they were all gentlemen at the time, "this is not a refugee bill at all, for its purpose is to help Jews." And the reaction of the lawmakers was, "Oh, gee, I hadn't thought of that." Well, forget it. That was the end of it. In December of 1942, a month after the State Department officially confirmed the existence of a plan for a final solution, when it had been announced in newspapers all over the country that Hitler was trying to kill every Jew in the world, Roosevelt sent a bill to Congress asking for presidential authority to waive immigration restrictions in individual cases, because during a war sometimes you need to move a spy or a prisoner of war or an agent in and out of the country without going through the bureaucracy. It was a fairly standard request. Congress turned him down because Newsweek reported at the time they were afraid he would use it to help Jews. And there was nothing he could do about it. At the time, you could get up in the floor of Congress and talk about the kikes ruining the country and people would applaud. Nowadays, David Duke needs to convince people he's not an anti-Semite. He is. But he wants us to... Louis Farrakhan plays Mendelssohn concertos on the violin and asks for meetings with Abe Foxman because he wants us to believe he's not an anti-Semite. Why? In 1942, if you wanted to do something that had nothing to do with the Jews, God forbid it should look like it might help the Jews. You had to look like you didn't like Jews or you were in trouble. Today, you have to look like you do like Jews or you're in trouble. That's how much America has changed. In 1942, public opinion polls showed that about 2/3 of Americans thought Jews had too much power in this country. Too much power in this country. Almost 30% thought Jews were a threat to America. In 1945, in December of 1945, 6 months after the war was over, after everybody had seen newsreel pictures of Eisenhower walking through the death camps and shaking his head, the piles of bodies, it was no secret. America didn't suddenly discover the Holocaust years later. People knew. And in December of 1945, public opinion polls showed almost 70% thought Jews had too much power. 30% thought Jews were a threat to America. Too much power. Now, here's the interesting thing. In 1955, public opinion polls, and these are a lot of polls, they're Roper, Gallup, they all did the same thing. By 1955, public opinion polls showed that about a quarter, 30% of Americans thought Jews had too much power, and about 6% thought Jews were a threat to America. Which is to say, between 1945 and 1955, anti-Semitism dropped off the map. It's continued to go down, but now it goes down incrementally from 28% to 22%. To the latest poll is 12%. There's problems with the poll, but you see roughly where we are. Something happened between 1945 and 1955 to change the way Jews are seen in America. And as a result of that, everything else changed. Now what happened? The Holocaust? People became aware of the horrors to be wrought by bigotry. Could be part of it. I mean, it's no doubt part of it, but why weren't they bothered in December of 1945? I don't know. I don't have the answer. It may be part of the answer. It's not the whole answer. Some people would say the creation of the State of Israel. Finally, Jews aren't losers. Jews come from somewhere. Americans hate losers. Americans liked Israel from the beginning. There is polling data from the early 50s to show that the average American didn't connect Israel and American Jews in their mind. By 1955, it is not at all clear that the existence of the State of Israel had anything to do in the average American mind with the American Jew. Now, these may be part of the answer, but you would have to, let me put it like this. Beginning in August of 1945, actually in August of 1945, the American Jewish Congress hired a staff of lawyers and began suing anti-Semites. Unprecedented. They began looking for people to sue. Discrimination in housing, take them to court. There's no law against it, find one. They were lobbying state after state, beginning in the fall of 1945 in the New York State Legislature, a bill that outlawed discrimination in education on the basis of race or religion. The words now flow off our tongue like water. Of course, discrimination on the basis of race or religion. It was a revolution. In 1940, Jews couldn't live in most neighborhoods in America. Jews couldn't work in most industries in America. The average job ad said Christians only. Jews couldn't get into most colleges in America. Jews who wanted to go to medical school went to Mexico or Europe. The president of Dartmouth, in the fall of 1945, gave an interview to the New York Post, the Schiff newspaper, about why it was a good thing that Dartmouth had quotas against Jews. Because Dartmouth is for Christians. It's fine, no problem. By 1955, that was illegal in most states. The American Jewish Congress and the NAACP formed a coalition. They opened up an office together. The head of the NAACP chaired it. The National Jewish Community Relations Council staffed it. It came to be called the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. It still exists. It's still got an office. It coordinates legislative efforts against bigotry. And they went state by state, and they got laws passed outlawing discrimination on the basis of race or religion in housing, in schools, and in jobs. And by 1960, it was illegal in most of the country. In 1965, it became illegal at the federal level because of a campaign waged by the American Jewish Congress and the Anti-Defamation League and the NAACP and the Urban League in something called the Black Jewish Coalition. The American Jewish Committee started taking people to court over prayers in public schools, the American Jewish Congress, the Anti-Defamation League. It was unprecedented. Jewish kids used to have to sit through the Lord's Prayer every day of their life. They were reminded every day that they were second-class citizens. In 1961, that became illegal. We did that. I remember in the 50s on Long Island, we used to see film strips in public school produced by the Anti-Defamation League telling you it was wrong to hate, that people were all the same under the skin. The National Conference of Christians and Jews, the Anti-Defamation League, they used to have brotherhood weeks in shopping malls in Omaha, in Texas, telling people it's wrong to hate. In 1930, most Americans thought it was fine. By 1960s, most Americans thought it was wrong. You can't tell me that a multi-million-dollar campaign to create an effect took place and the effect happened and the multi-million-dollar campaign had nothing to do with it. It was a major factor. The Jewish community changed the way America thinks about minorities. We opened the door for ourselves and others. We changed this country. The people in this room, the Jewish community, the Jewish leadership, those nobodies, those self-appointed, plutocratic, do-nothing nobodies, changed the way America works. And beginning in 1967 and 68, they changed the way we operate on the world level. Israel now gets $3 billion a year in aid. America gives away $12 billion a year. 1/4 of it goes to Israel. Israel is 1/10 of 1% of the world's population. And here's a funny thing. The Congressional Black Caucus, 37 members, is one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the foreign aid bill and the Israel aid section every year. You ask a black congressman or woman, why would the blacks be so enthusiastically in favor of foreign aid? They'll say, first of all, because we have a working alliance at a day-to-day level with the Jewish community. This is their cause. They support ours. We support theirs. Second, and perhaps more important these days, we need aid to Africa. Africa gets $750 million in aid every year. And then you go ahead and ask, well, is it fair that Africa gets $750 million with hundreds of millions of people, and Israel gets $3 billion? With 5 million people? And the answer would probably be, you know what? If it weren't for Israel's $3 billion, there wouldn't be foreign aid. Most Americans don't like it. Most members of Congress don't like it. It passes Congress because the Jewish community lobbies it through. That's our issue. We make sure it happens, and it happens. We do that. What is $3 billion a year? People say, oh, Israel's well developed. $3 billion a year in aid to Israel does one thing first and foremost. It tells the Arabs, you can't fool with Israel. In 1968, Israel got what, 25 million, 100 million? Johnson may have raised it to 500 million. Nixon made it $2.5 billion and then $3 billion. Up until 1970 or 72, Israel was a moral outpost of Western democracy and values in the Middle East, and the Arabs' plan was to destroy it. As of 1980, Israel was an American strategic asset in which America had invested already 20 or 30 billion. Now it's up to like 70 or 80 billion. Do the math. America doesn't walk away from that kind of investment. There's a difference between being a moral outpost and a strategic outpost and a major investment. It's not an accident that the Arabs are negotiating peace. There's nothing they can do about it anymore. It was a signal that we sent. So now we get to the difficult question. Who is this we? Did we change America? Did anybody here in this room change America? Planted a tree once. I'll tell you a funny story. About a year and a half ago, I think it was, Marlon Brando was on Larry King. And he said something about how Jews run Hollywood. You remember this? There was a big explosion. And he was forced to apologize in tears the next day to a delegation of the Anti-Defamation League and the local Community Relations Council in L.A. And he didn't know what came over him. The funny thing is what came over him was a sudden attack of truth. It's an odd thing. What he said was, if you read the transcript, they were talking about blacks on the screen. And he said, you know, Hollywood has not been kind to blacks. It treats them unfairly. They're always waiters or drug addicts or gangsters. It's especially considering that Hollywood is run by Jews and Jews have traditionally been more sensitive to minorities than others. I would have expected better. And that's when the phones lit up. Within an hour, Rabbi Harvey Fields, who's basically a very nice guy, head of the CRC, Community Relations Committee of the LA Federation, was on the local news saying, did you hear that guy? It was the old canard. The Jews run Hollywood, the Jews run Congress, the Jews run the bank. It's not fair. But he didn't say the Jews run Hollywood. He said Jews run Hollywood. One word, you're saying? Big deal. It's a very big deal. Jews run Hollywood. Look at the studios. Right around that time, the newspapers were full of Edgar Bronfman Jr. had just bought Universal Pictures. The big question was, would the chairman and president of Universal, Lou Wasserman and Sid Sheinberg, keep their jobs under the new regime? And in the middle of the debate, right around the time Marlon Brando was on TV, the Times had a little story at the bottom of page D1, the business page at the time, a box, the top 10 studios, the chairman and president of each, the 20 people who run Hollywood. Guess what? There was one Gentile on the list. Jews run Hollywood. The Jews do not run Hollywood. What do I mean? Think of it for a minute. The Americans went into Somalia in 1993, and it was a mess. Did anybody in this room go to Somalia in 1993? No? Hands? I didn't think so. Maybe 3,000 men and women went to Somalia wearing our uniforms, paid for with our tax dollars, sent by the government we elected. And it is therefore fair to say, since we sent them, the Americans went to Somalia. The French made a hash of Rwanda. They played the different ethnic groups against each other for decades, and in the end it devolved into genocide, and it's basically the fault of the French. 70 million French people? 500 diplomats and career soldiers. Sent by the French taxpayer, by the government they elected, and therefore the French did it, whether or not they knew about it, whether or not they even voted that year. In that same sense, the Jews get foreign aid through Congress. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, Hadassah, the National Council of Jewish Women. These are the organizations we create, that we pay for, that we send to Washington to do our bidding. They are us. And the Conference of Presidents, which is a council of the presidents of each organization, which were elected by whoever showed up at the meetings when the elections were held, and if you didn't, I'm sorry. They carry out our bidding. They are us. We got foreign aid through Congress, and that's perfectly fair to say. And if you don't like foreign aid, it's fair to blame the Jews. If you don't like the movies, blame those people. They don't listen to the Anti-Defamation League any more than they listen to the NAACP. They're private citizens who happen to be Jewish. Jews run Hollywood. The Jews get foreign aid through Congress. I'll give you another example. Koreans run dry cleaning in New York. It's a simple fact. Walk down the street, find one that's not run by Koreans. The Koreans do not run dry cleaning in New York. There's no committee in Seoul figuring out how to ruin my shirts. Koreans do, the Koreans don't. Marlon Brando said, Jews run Hollywood. Louis Farrakhan says, the Jews run Hollywood. He says it all the time. He said in a speech last year, there's a committee in New York that meets every year of Jewish organizations to decide what movies are going to get made. It's rubbish. He believes it. He thinks the Jews run Hollywood. Marlon Brando said Jews run Hollywood. There's a difference. So who is the Jews? As I say, it's the organizations that speak for us. As I say, it's 11 Jewish senators and 24 Jewish members of Congress. It is, in a sense, Undersecretary of State Stuart Eizenstat, Assistant Secretary of State Dennis Ross. You know, in the Bush administration, that famous anti-Semite, of 19 assistant secretaries in the State Department, Latin America, Western Europe, international organizations, there's 17 of them, 19 of them. 7 were Jews, including Princeton Lyman, the Assistant Secretary for Refugee Affairs. Daughter was a Baal Tshuva in a Jerusalem yeshiva. The fact that 40,000, 1/3 of all the visas to American refugees were going to Jews from Russia, it didn't hurt to have our guy in there. We didn't put him there. Was it luck? Was it planning? It doesn't make that much of a difference. It helps in a situation like that. That's also Jewish influence. In 1991, you remember they lifted all of the Jews out of Ethiopia. Israeli airplanes came in on a Friday afternoon and started flying out 20,000 people over the next 25 hours. It's interesting. The Israelis flew the planes. We did everything else. It was an American Jewish group that went up into the mountains where the Jews lived, hired a fleet of trucks and trucked them all down to Addis Ababa and dumped them in the front yard of the Israeli embassy and said, now ignore them. It was the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee that set up a tent camp and kept them alive for the next few months. It was the Conference of Presidents and the Joint and the Jewish Agency that organized with President Bush and the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, Herman Cohen, to get the warring sides in the Ethiopian Civil War, who had been slaughtering each other for a decade, to take a break for 24 hours on May 19th so the Jews can get their people out and then go back to slaughtering each other. So the we is our organizations. It's the politicians that we elect. It's the officials who are willing to work with us, and sometimes it's non-Jews who admire us. And very often it's non-Jews who are married to Jews and feel as though they're part of the Jewish people. I could give you dozens of examples. It's the Jewish voters. It's the Jews who are willing to rally. It's the Jews who are willing to show up. It's the Jews who write letters. It's the Jews who make phone calls. It's Jews who make political donations. You know, the Clinton campaign in December of '92 did a calculation of where their money came from, $150 million in presidential campaign money. About a half of it, by their calculation, 55%, came from Jews. 55% of the presidential campaign money. Now, not all of it was given by Jews. Some of it was given by non-Jews to Jewish fundraisers who handed it to the campaign and said, here. Not all of it was pro-Israel money. Some of it was pro-abortion rights money. Some of it was pro-civil rights money. But it was all money coming from Jews, and the message was, this is the Jewish community. Listen to us when we come by. So this is where we are today. That's where we were 60 years ago. Why does it feel so bad if things are so good? You know, they say there's a sense that anti-Semitism has risen in America. Jews feel that it shows up in polls all the time. In 1982, I think it was, or 83, the yearly American Jewish Committee poll of American Jewish public opinion showed that 45% of Jews thought anti-Semitism was a serious problem in America. In 1990, 80% thought so. Why? For one thing, it's better reported. Our pain is everybody's pain now. Holocaust conferences, front page stories about a painting that's missing, front page stories about a Torah scroll that got flooded in Hurricane Mitch, tens of thousands of people flooded, drowned, starving, front page stories about Torah scrolls that get saved. People care about our feelings, partly because Jews are heavily involved in journalism as well. Americans are willing to listen to us. Americans admire us. That's the flip side of the Anti-Defamation League poll that was released last week. Even among the people they classified as anti-Semites. You know, they said 12% of Americans are now intensely anti-Semitic, including 34% of blacks. The problem with this poll is they ask people to say yes or no to 11 stereotypes. Jews stick together. Jews want to run everything. Jews are more loyal to Israel than America. Jews are cheat in business, and so on. If you answer yes to 6 of them, you're in the most anti-Semitic category. They've been doing it for years. That's how they do it. There's a problem with it. When they did it in '92, they ran focus groups. And lo and behold, a significant number of people, particularly blacks, were answering yes, and I think it's a great thing. Jews stick together. Why can't blacks? Jews want to run everything. Blacks would be better off if they did too. Some percentage of the people classified as anti-Semitic like Jews. And in fact, in the current poll, if you read the booklet they put out, they say it's anomalous. They also threw in positive stereotypes. Jews are strong believers in God. Jews contribute greatly to American culture. Jews blah, blah, blah. And great majorities, including among the people they label anti-Semites, answer yes, Jews contribute greatly to American culture. Jews make America better. Jews are willing to contribute. Jews are generous. It's amazing stuff. Americans admire us. Jerry Seinfeld is the most popular person on television. The guy that people want to invite into their home every Thursday night. He's a Jewish guy who does Jewish programs, who talks about his moil and his rabbi. It's not a problem. They do spin-off shows where they have Courtney Cox plays a Jew. Monica with the brother Ross on Friends. Now the Goyim are playing us. Al Jolson used to put on blackface. Now they're playing us. Not a very Jewish person. It's not that big a deal, just as it isn't that big a deal to most American Jews, but Jewish. It doesn't hurt to have a Jewish character on television. In fact, it helps. More and more shows are doing it. Americans admire us. This is one of the reasons that we are effective, one of the reasons that we are able to mobilize. Our organizations are the envy of the world. We think there's too many of them. People send delegations from around the world to sit down with the Anti-Defamation League or the American Jewish Committee and find out how they can get organized like the American Jews are. I was at the 92 Democratic Convention in New York at the Native American Democratic Caucus. Tribal leaders from all over the country had a separate meeting. Senator Inouye, the head of the Indian Affairs Committee, gives a talk, I don't know, treaties, liquor, whatever they talk about in the Indian political agenda. And when he's done, the hands go up. Can you help us meet with the Jews? They really know how to organize. Next day, the Asian American and Pacific Democratic Caucus, a couple of hundred delegates who are of Asian background. Representative Matsui from California gives the same talk. It's about Japanese reparations. It's about immigration laws. He's done. Hands go up. Can you help us meet with the Jews? They really know how to organize. And they did, by the way. They helped, and they helped. So why do things feel so bad? For one thing, we're more aware of the problems. For another thing, we're not aware of the good part. The people who speak out are the people who are mad, which is natural in politics. You know, they send out attack letters for fundraising because threats get people's blood going. Good news doesn't. You can't get people to pour out in the streets and carry signs saying everything's okay. So we hear about the bad news. There are 2 Jews in the world today, as far as I know, who are in jail for being Jews. Jonathan Pollard and Ron Arad. That's too many, but it's a lot better than it was 40 years ago or 60 years ago. Maybe there's a half a dozen others. Our situation in the world today is better than it has been, certainly in decades, perhaps in history. There's something in our culture, the culture of complaint. You know, here I can complain. That's part of it. It's famous. I don't need to go into it in too much detail. There are real problems. Louis Farrakhan is out there. He doesn't like us. And he's got influence on young people. And people listening to his speeches walk out of the room not liking us. That's not good. That's a problem. To say that we are stronger than our enemies doesn't mean we don't have enemies. You know, people say, what do we need the Anti-Defamation League or the American Jewish Congress for anymore? Which is sort of like saying, well, we've got highways. What do we need a highway budget for? Cancel the highway budget and see how long it is before you don't have highways anymore. We are where we are because of the organizations we created and the work we did and the work we continue to do. All of us together. Finally, things feel bad in part because of a bunch of nonsense that gets passed around as truth. A lot of people get fixated on a number, 52% intermarriage. If you read my column, you know it's simply not true. And the people who put it out basically know that. Most Jews marry Jews. And most of those who marry non-Jews send their kids for bar mitzvah. That's the statistical fact. Most Jews, and the number of Jews in America is increasing every year. The American Jewish Yearbook comes out every year with a census. They count community by community. And every year it's higher. And every year the sociologists who did that ridiculous poll in 1990, about 52%, accompany it with an essay explaining that for some reason the numbers keep on going up, even though we know, based on this poll we did, that they should be going down. Soon they'll figure out that we were right. They never do. The numbers keep on going up. Just like the Jewish Republicans every 4 years. This year the Jews will turn right, and again it's 80% Democratic. Nobody can figure it out. Jewish donations are going down. The UJA is disappearing. They just raised $1.6 billion. Number 2 after the United Way, the second biggest charity in America, much bigger than the American Red Cross, much bigger than the Salvation Army. $1.6 billion, and that's just in the main campaigns. And that's not counting all the Hebrew school tuitions, and that's not counting Hadassah. They're not going down. Numbers to Israel are going down. The donations, well, first of all, Israel may not need our money, although it would certainly send a bad message to Congress. Please give Israel $3 billion because we want to send the Arabs a message, but we're keeping our money. Fortunately, the numbers to Israel are going up. If you add together Friends of Hebrew University, Friends of Weizmann Institute, Friends of Hadassah Hospital, all the yeshiva organizations, it's about $700 million a year, and that's not counting Israel bonds. Altogether, about $1.5 billion gets transferred every year from American Jews to Israel. $1.5 billion, and it goes up every year. The amount going from the UJA goes down every year as the amount going to independent campaigns for universities and hospitals that used to get money from the UJA but don't anymore, go up. The system is changing, but it's not collapsing. Young Jews are getting bar mitzvahs. They're growing up, they're sowing wild oats in college, then they're getting married and having Jewish children. Not everybody considers all those children Jewish. I was just in San Antonio, it's interesting. The Orthodox rabbi co-officiates with the Reform rabbi at weddings. The Reform rabbi understands that the Orthodox rabbi is going to bring his own kosher witnesses. And the Orthodox rabbi understands that the Reform rabbi might bring in a woman cantor. And they coexist. The Orthodox rabbi doesn't recognize the conversions of the Reform rabbi for purposes of marriage. If one of their converts wants to get married to an Orthodox congregant, they got to get converted again. But if a Reform convert gets elected president of the Federation, the Orthodox rabbi is happy to shake hands with a fellow member of the Jewish people, somebody who has cast his or her lot in with us and is part of us, even if not in the religious sense that I value. Everybody makes compromises. That's what we've lost. That's why things feel so bad. We are so caught up in the trivialities of how right we are about some issue that we can't see the larger truth. Compromise has become a dirty word. We don't know how to live with each other anymore. How are we going to live with the rest of the world? Everybody talks about moral relativism. You can't compromise with evil. And anything I don't like is evil, so I can never compromise. So, of course, it feels like we're in terrible conflict with the rest of the world. The rest of the world is not in such terrible conflict with us. The rest of the world respects us and likes us. And most of the time we know it. So the biggest problem that we have is not solving any particular problem. It's sort of getting by. It's sort of taking a deep breath, calming down, and looking how far we've come. It's appreciating what we've got. It's being willing to hold two thoughts in our head at the same time. I vehemently disagree with this person or that person. I am very against Reform conversions. I'm very in favor of Reform conversions. I'm for or against abortion rights. I am for or against, you name the issue. Yes, have strong opinions, fight for your views, show up when meetings are held, demand elections, and afterwards, win or lose, carry on. You know, there's a story about the British Secret Service. They got word that the polar ice cap was melting. So they ran to the Queen, they said, it's the end. Civilization as we know it, we're all going to be under 20 feet of water within 6 months. That's the end. So the Queen calls in the clergy. She says, you have to prepare the public for doom. Archbishop of Canterbury gets on the tube, and he says, my beloved flock, it is the end of days. Return to the church and receive the sacraments, for surely salvation is only through works. And then the moderator of the Scottish Presbyterian Church gets on and he says, no, brothers and sisters, salvation is only through faith. receive Jesus into your heart and prepare to meet your Maker, for surely the end is near. And then the chief rabbi gets on and he says, ladies and gentlemen, it looks like we have 6 months to learn how to live underwater. I believe we have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions and answers if anybody wants to. Let's get the house lights here so I can see you. That includes. I would remind you that if you have something like a declaration or an imprecation, I would enjoy that, but keep it fairly brief so other people can yell at me afterwards. Sir, you were first. I'll repeat it.
As a young Jew, you can see the fundamentals there are not Jewish. And I'll be frank, I find most of my contemporaries are Jewish are very different. Now, counter that, a lot of Arabs are coming from America. They're the largest more ethnic group. They're organizing. For example, there was an article in the Jerusalem Report, a Jewish bureau, that the president of the Arab organization, James Sahabi, has and the arguments Israel, and they're organizing. They're 12 Arabs. They're organizing. I have a question for 30 or 40 years as there's more assimilation, marriage, which will happen. I don't want to debate you about the numbers. You have valid points. You see Arab Americans developing counter-institutions. They'll counter-influence and might eventually so-called weapons to Israel. An end run, as they say, military strategy. I would like your any thoughts on that.
The question was, given that he essentially agrees with my analysis of where we are today, do I think we could be in big trouble in 30 or 40 years as Arab Americans grow as one of the fastest growing immigration groups here and get organized the way we are and essentially reach the point where they can cut off weaponry to Israel and overrun Israel, I presume? It's possible. If you're going to ask me a question about what's going to happen in 10 years, I'm going to warn you that the Talmud teaches us that after the fall of the Second Temple, prophecy was given to children and fools. I don't want to take a big chance on this. I will tell you an interesting story. After the Oslo Accord, 1993, after the handshake on the White House lawn, there were meetings of an unprecedented nature between Jewish and Arab groups to try and see how to get past and live in the next era, get past old enmities and begin to work together as fellow immigrant, fellow ethnic groups with a lot of common agenda in cities all over Canada. With the blessings and assistance of the Canadian Embassy in Ottawa and of the Canada-Israel Committee, which is their APAC, and the Canadian Jewish Congress, which is their Conference of Presidents. Jewish groups and Arab groups around America began to do this, and the Israeli Embassy and APAC and the Conference of Presidents sent out a message saying, no, don't do that. It's too early. They're not our friends yet. We have moved the conflict from the battlefield to the negotiating table, but it's still a conflict. So to talk about how to live in the next era, let's wait till we get there. Now, what was different about Canada and the United States? The difference is the Canadian Jews don't really influence Ottawa, and Ottawa doesn't influence the Middle East, so they can be treated as people. We are too important to be treated as people. We are a blunt weapon to be used against the American administration, and to do that, we need to be kept scared out of our wits and angry and ready to attack. And the last thing that the Israeli embassy needed in 1993, as it was entering a very difficult negotiation, was for us to be talking peace with our Arab American neighbors. Within 40 or 50 years, it is very likely that we will be talking about issues like, how do we get Jewish and Muslim holidays to be recognized in mostly Christian towns? What about kosher meat? Things like that. There already is cooperation on many levels. As far as them getting organized in the way that we are, they should live so long. They should live so long. They can't organize. No group is organized in any way as effectively as we are, and that includes groups that are much bigger than us, and they are not nearly as big as us. And many of the Arab Americans are Christian Arabs from... Donna Shalal is an Arab American. She's pro-Israel. George Mitchell is an Arab American. He's very pro-Israel. John Sununu is an Arab American. He's anti-Israel. But they're much more mixed, for example, than we are. We have our disagreements about Israeli policy. How many of us don't like Israel? Not too many. A Jew can be a spy. A Jew can be a spy. Yes, he is a Jew and a spy. Now, his offense, just on a technicality, I basically agree with you. So let me just make one point. A treasonable offense, treason is the only crime defined in the Constitution. It is defined as waging war against the United States in alliance with its enemies. Israel's not an enemy of the United States, and Pollard did not commit treason. He passed privileged classified information to a foreign power. That's illegal. It's not treasonous. He negotiated a plea bargain with the prosecutor for leniency, and he didn't get it. Now, the question is, why didn't he get the leniency that the government had agreed to give him? There's all kinds of theories going around. The Pollardistas basically say because there's anti-Semitism rampant in the American government. I find that hard to believe. I mean, since Pollard was in jail, we have had a Jewish CIA director. Anybody here know there was a Jewish CIA? John Deutsch, Clinton's first CIA director? Jewish guy. Jews can go anywhere and do anything in this country. Now, here's the catch. My sources, that's what I do. I call up people, they talk to me. Some of them don't want to be identified. This person certainly didn't want to be identified. A very high-ranking Washington, like a power player who used to be a senior administration official in a previous administration, told me that he heard from a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time that they had asked Secretary Weinberger to ask the judge to throw the book at Jonathan Pollard to teach American Jews a lesson. What does that mean? Pardon? I have no reason not to believe it because the source is impeccable and none of the other explanations I've heard make any sense. Not the government's public explanations and not the Jewish activists. Let me finish. Yeah, well, in 1950, if you recall, it was very difficult for a Jew to get a job with the government, with security agencies. Jews didn't get, I am talking about 1950, sir, I'm trying to make a point. In 1990, thousands of Jews have security clearance because as a result of the work we did, it is no longer legitimate to think Jews are disloyal. Jews are no longer to be thought of as hyphenated Americans. Pollard announced otherwise. He said, I am a Jew, I have security clearance, I get information. Faced with a choice, my first loyalty is to Israel. Now, at the time, the Pentagon's reaction was, my God, how many Pollards are there? We didn't know this was possible. We were promised this was impossible. And here's a guy who says, not only did I do it, I'm proud of it. How many other people are there like that? We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. Now, if that is true, and this is the explanation I've been given, and it's been backed up by others, nobody wants to say this publicly because this is illegal. It's an abuse of the judicial system. However, it's something to think about because people have been in the streets ever since waving placards saying Jonathan Pollard's a hero. Jonathan Pollard says he expresses remorse, but he had to do what he had to do because Israel needed him. Israel says he was a Jew loyal to his homeland. What's the Pentagon supposed to think? The Jewish organizations, originally the mainstream, the central ones, the ones that wield the power, that form the central committees that divide up the work and coordinate their policies, and believe me, they do every week, formed a committee, an ad hoc committee consisting of representatives from the Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox synagogue unions, Hadassah and B'nai B'rith, the two largest Jewish organizations, the Anti-Defamation League, American Jewish Congress, and American Jewish Committee, the three Jewish defense agencies, and the four biggest Jewish federations, New York, Chicago, LA, and Philadelphia. And they sat down and they listened to the Pollard family, and they listened to the government, and they decided we ain't getting involved. Why? We feel bad for the guy. He was acting as a Jew. He loved Israel. We admire people who love Israel. But his act threatens to undo everything we've done in the last 50 years, to raise once again the question of whether Jews are really Americans. As long as there's people in this, and they told the Pollard family, get those crazy people out of the street. If there's a demonstration outside the White House saying Jonathan Pollard is a hero, and we walk in the next day saying we'd like him out, we're endorsing that demonstration. We're saying we are in favor of Jews choosing Israel over America. We are apologizing for everything we've said over the last 50 years. We're saying, no, we're not really Americans. Get them off the street, let the echoes die down, and in 2 or 3 years, if the atmosphere has changed, we can try and work for his release. And if you watch the news after the Y plantations, the prosecutor who tried Pollard, Joe DeGeneva, was on TV after the whole thing blew up, saying on MSNBC flat out, Pollard is in jail with a disproportionate sentence compared to others who've spied for allies, because he's there to teach Americans a lesson that you can't spy for an ally, that it is as wrong as to spy for an ally as for an enemy. He couldn't have been clearer unless he'd come out and said Jew, which of course he couldn't. But that's why he's in jail. He's in jail not because any Jew can go to jail. Obviously, most Jews aren't in jail. But because of a Jewish issue. That's why he's in jail. If you look at the country today, if you look at the Congress today, it's pulling teeth to get $12 billion out. It used to be $15 billion. For a while, it was $18 billion. There is still $12 billion because even some of those yahoos from out there in America understand that they can't eliminate foreign aid and they can't give all of it to Israel. They're all in favor of aid to Israel. They love Israel. Congress loves Israel. Republicans love Israel. Christians from Wyoming love Israel. It's a crazy thing. Convince them to give more aid to Africa? I'd like to. I mean, the fact that AIPAC is able to work with other lobbying groups and with various legislators to get foreign aid passed is a little bit of a miracle in the current atmosphere. I think you're asking for more miracles than we've got. One of the points I made in my book, people often ask me, aren't you afraid that you're giving secrets away and fomenting anti-Semitism? The answer is simple. You can't read 2 pages into my book without understanding that the Jewish community is much more powerful and influential than most Jews realize, but not nearly as influential as most non-Jews fantasize. It's somewhere in the middle. We're not miracle workers. Yes. I'm not a rabbi.
No, but regarding Jewish organizations, most Jews, as I understand it, have not been to Israel, do not give to Jewish causes, except in times of crises. And then there's a question. How do we get down to the grassroots level, and particularly to young people, to develop, and also I hear with young people, I work on various committees, where young people don't have a real Jewish pride. They're going to get their bar mitzvah, and the day after their bar mitzvah, their parents are going to drop out of the synagogue. There's not great affiliation with synagogues. I'm not talking about the Orthodox now. I'm talking about the general American. How do we get down to the grassroots level to understand? Obviously, people who go to meetings and know things know, agree with you and understand what you're saying, but how do you get to the 75% of Jews that aren't?
You know, it's a funny thing. Most Jews walk into synagogue on Yom Kippur. The great majority drop by for a few minutes. And it's boring. And they don't understand what's going on. And what they do get is usually something to the effect of, where were you last week? If you want to get Jews to show up, well, the short answer is clone Rolando Matalon. The longer answer is, look at what's going on at B'nai Jeshurun. They can't keep them out. The place is bursting at the seams over on West End Avenue. Why? Because it's fun. It's fun. What's wrong with having fun? Young people want to have fun. Old people want to have fun. There's a million things to do with yourself on a Tuesday night, on a Friday night, on a Saturday morning. You want to bring Jews in? First of all, make it available to them, make it understandable. Third of all, make it fun. Third of all, lower the price. Which means take money that is now going for, I don't know, another hospital, for another Holocaust museum, and put it into Hebrew school tuitions. Get better Hebrew school teachers. Pay them better so that Hebrew school isn't boring. Most Jewish kids are never going to go to day schools. If the tuitions, my kids go to day school. I just wrote the first tuition check about 6 months ago. I almost became a convert to state aid to parochial schools, and I'm a flaming liberal, but that's a lot of money. But most Jews won't do that. They don't want to be that Jewish. They don't want to be non-Jews, and they don't want to be that Jewish. Make Hebrew schools more fun. Give them a good time. Teach them things they want to know. And relax. Because those kids are going to have kids also, and they're going to show up twice a year. You know, synagogue membership is about 50. By the way, most Jews give to Jewish causes. Synagogue membership is about 50%, but that's a deceptive number. Because about 25% of American Jews join a shul every year whether they need to or not. They're the ones who 20% keep kosher, about almost 20% send their kids to day school. 18% celebrate Israeli Independence Day, 30% claim to celebrate Sukkot, at least they've heard of it. 80%, 85% get a bar mitzvah. 90% go to a Seder. 80% light Hanukkah candles. 70% say they fast on Yom Kippur. They think they fast. Whatever they do, it's something that matters enough to them to say that they're honoring the holiday. So somewhere between the 25% and the 80%, you've got 55, well, if it's 85, about 60% of American Jews light Hanukkah candles, go to a Seder, fast on Yom Kippur, send their kids to bar mitzvah, and that's it. That's what they want. You may get them to do more if it's fun, but the obligation they feel is that much. So what does that tell you? That there's about 65% who are going to join a synagogue when the kid turns 10 and quit right after bar mitzvah. Out of that 60%, you get the 50% is made up of 25% who join every year, and the other 25% are those from the rest who joined this year. In the same way that the 50% who give to Jewish causes are 25% who give every year, and the other 25% who gave this year and may give again in 2 years. Most Jews are involved as much as they want to be. If you want them to be more involved, listen to them. Find out what they want. They're out there. They're waiting for somebody to listen to them. Yes?
How disturbed are you by the growing figure that more than a third of blacks are anti-Semitic, and what can we do about it?
If I could be cruel, how disturbed am I that more than a third of blacks are anti-Semitic, and what can we do about it? It's nice to live in a country where our worst enemies are the one group that's more despised than us. Now, that's an ugly thought, but it's true. The mainstream regards us as part of them. This is not necessarily a bad thing. It's too bad we live in a country that is racist. But at least it's not against us. I don't expect Louis Farrakhan to become president. I'm not worried about that. I do know there have been a certain number of Jews who have been killed because they're Jews in this country over the last 2 centuries. There were Jews who were lynched after the Civil War, strung up because blacks and Jews got it. There was a Jew lynched in Georgia in 1913. There was a Jew who was shot by the survivalists in Denver in 1982. Jews periodically get killed. Of all the Jews who have been killed for being Jews in this country, one was killed by blacks, Yankel Rosenbaum. Only one. Under very unusual circumstances. I could go on forever about exactly what happened in the summer of '91 between the Lubavitch and the black community and the Amsterdam news and the atmosphere that very hot summer that resulted in somebody getting killed. It's not likely to be recreated. Nonetheless, it's bad to have somebody running around telling young blacks we are their enemies. It is also bad. We are deeply disturbed, but bearing in mind that many blacks who are classified as anti-Semites actually admire us. Bear that in mind. Bear in mind that you can't find a group on Capitol Hill that is more supportive of our causes than the black members, who see themselves as our allies and see us as their allies. The leadership of the black community. Jesse Jackson used to go around saying Zionism is a poisonous weed. He's tired of hearing about the Holocaust, hugging Yasser Arafat in the 1970s when Arafat was vowing to destroy Israel. All of a sudden, in 1992, he's giving speeches in Yitzhak Rabin's memory, or in praise. 96, it was the memory. And in 92, he actually flew to Brussels to give the keynote speech at a World Jewish Congress conclave on anti-Semitism and what to do about it. What changed Jesse Jackson? Did he suddenly wake up and go, my God, what was I thinking? No. Jesse Jackson was under enormous pressure throughout the 1980s from other black leaders who said, you're ruining our lives. We can't function as a community leadership without an alliance with the Jewish community. You have become a sticking point. Fix it. Why is Louis Farrakhan trying so hard to make up with the Jews? Why does he want to meet with Abe Foxman? Because he feels bad? Because he's under pressure. Because most of the black leadership knows they need us. Now, black kids get riled up very easily. Most kids get riled up very easily, and black kids are angry because their community is in trouble. Because a quarter of all black men are in jail of a certain age. Because blacks live far below others from an economic point of view, because the unemployment rate in the black community is enormous. And when their newspapers are full of things like affirmative action is under attack, a guy named Ginsburg filed a lawsuit. Much of the attack on the black political agenda has been led by Jews. For good reasons. I mean, we are in favor of a colorblind society. I'm sorry. Our big issue over the last 30 years was Israel. You cross us, you're in trouble with us, you're our enemy. Don't cross us in Israel. If you don't like Israel, live with it. Stifle it. If you feel bad for the poor Palestinians, cry yourself to sleep at night. Don't bother us in the morning. We are supporting Israel. If you want to be our friends, you're supporting Israel. That was our policy. That was our policy. It's an understandable policy. It worked. Israel is now safer than it's ever been. In the black community, it was affirmative action. It created a black middle class during the 1970s. It's been under assault since the American right returned to power. If you're in favor of us, you're in favor of affirmative action. The Jewish community, as an organized entity, appeared to turn against that. Why wouldn't they regard us as their enemies? For reasons that we think are perfectly valid, but they were begging us behind the scenes, their leadership and our leadership. You don't like it? Live with it. Stifle it. It's not going to hurt you. Jews haven't gone down on the teaching. I mean, Jews haven't lost jobs because of affirmative action. Everybody predicted they would. It hasn't happened. They haven't lost places in college because of affirmative. It hasn't happened. We could have just stifled it because the black community, our allies, felt so strongly about it. We wouldn't. They're mad at us. A lot of what's going on in the black community at the intellectual level, which is what worries me, is not hatred, it's anger. I'm worried about it, but I also believe it could be fixed if there were more honest negotiating and listening on both sides. I think we have time for one more question. So who's been the most patient? Over there. Fair enough.
Second of all, given the volume of information you gave up, the sensitivity of the information you gave up, and the fact that it didn't just go to Israel, it went from Israel to third countries. The United States doesn't know which countries went to because Israel has to corroborate it. And the United States has to presume that all of it is now lost and has control of America and its allies. His case was the greatest damage to our security of any breach to our security in our history, and his sentence was not unduly severe, and should not have been more lenient, as much as that has changed the case. Third of all, as far as loyalty to Israel is concerned, every American Jew has the right to give up his American citizenship, and every American Jew has the right to take Israeli citizenship. The difference between being a spy, as an Israeli, who is a spy for Israel, being an American, who is a traitor against his own country, it is a heinous crime. It is severe damage to America, to American Jews, and the position of American Jews in this country. Personally, I think it humiliated us as well as endangering us. I fully agree with the American Jewish lobby's refusal to support him. And my question is, when you pointed out that the American Jewish lobby basically backed off of supporting him at a critical time, you weren't clear about whether you agree with it or disagree with it. Obviously, I agree with it quite strongly, but I wasn't clear on your position.
My position? I was trying to describe what was going on. Basically, I think at the time, I don't agree with you. I have no way of knowing, I don't know whether you do, that the damage he did was the greatest of any traitor in American history. I don't know, Aldrich Ames gave up an awful lot. The Walkers gave up an awful lot. We don't know how much he gave up. Apparently there were 12 drops with a briefcase, and they talk about truckloads of information. Some of it doesn't make sense, and we may never know. The point there's another question, which is, before he went to work for the Navy, he applied for a job with AIPAC. The guy who interviewed him told me they turned him down flat because he had a screw loose. There was something wrong with him. The Navy, unfortunately, didn't have such good security. He thought he was Judah the Maccabee reincarnated to save the Jewish people. He made no secret about it. And he went ahead and did what the poor guy, I do believe, is probably suffering more than he needs to well, as I say, I don't believe that it's entirely the damage he did. I believe a lot of it is symbolic. Do I agree with the decision not to back him up as long as there were demonstrators supporting him? Yes. I think the notion that the Jewish community should embrace him as a hero or as a representative of what we think is best about American Judaism is a disastrous mistake, and contempt for what American Jews have done for ourselves and for this country. Having said that, I also believe that the poor guy, it's too bad that the only people who are supporting him are the people who would, think like him. And that's rather than, now that's not true, by the way. There are very distinguished, since the mid-90s, many Jewish organizations have come around. The feeling is now that issue is no longer on the table. Now it's an issue of this poor kid. He's been in jail for a very long time. He's not a kid anymore. For one terrible mistake. And we don't really, the case for all the damage he's done is not as convincing as you suggest. It may be true, but it hasn't really been demonstrated in any court of law. So there is a case for a humanitarian point to be made, but as long as all these loonies are waving all these signs, it's a little difficult to make that case. And he's going to have to wait until he learns to keep his mouth shut and let smarter people than him do his talking for him. Well, I think we're going to have to call this an evening. I appreciate it. If you have any more questions, I'm going to be outside sitting and signing books. If anybody wants to buy them, I will thank you. My landlord will thank you. And feel free to drop by even if you don't want to buy a book and you want to yell at me. So I'll be right outside. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.